Alrighty, let's get started. Welcome everyone to Professional Bezels. This is kind of a Q&A where you guys get to ask me questions about how to make heavy bezels or bezel set stones or different styles and everything kind of in between, because I'm sure we'll start talking about bezels and then we'll end up talking about something else. A lot of what we do with our live sessions is I'm recording this so that we can put it up on YouTube, and everybody who isn't able to attend right now can watch later. So please feel free to ask questions in the chat if you guys are comfortable being on video and want to hop on and ask a question. Let me know. You guys can check in and I'll probably put you up on the feed so that everybody can see you. But if you don't, just hang out with your video off or just do audio or something like that. It's fine as well. A lot of these are really successful with student participation, I guess you could say. I get a lot of ideas of what to kind of navigate the conversation to based on what you guys are looking to learn. All of this is kind of supported, so to speak, by our Patreon. It's a way for creators to make additional income by monthly payments from their followers or their students or their supporters, however you kind of want to look at that. And so that has been allowing us to create this additional content where we usually spend an hour or two talking and getting in some extra learning. So I guess we'll kind of jump into it. Our first question here is how to do corners on heavy bezels, and that's asked by Danielle. So let's take that back a step and talk about what is a heavy bezel. So for us, heavy bezels is 1 millimeter wire. We're not talking about gauge wire, we're talking about 1 millimeter rectangle. So if I was ordering it stock from Rio or Stellar or another manufacturer, they're probably going to talk about it in millimeters. So when I'm using bezel wire, I'm using 1 millimeter thick wire, and then I'm deciding how tall my wire needs to be from that. And that would be the dimensions that I order. Usually I'm stocking 1 millimeter by 3 millimeter wire, or I'm stocking 1 millimeter by 4 millimeter wire. And that 3 and 4 would be the height that it goes above the stone to come over and trap it. So that's heavy bezels. Compared to bezel wire, which tends to be 0.3 millimeters or 0.5 millimeters. And that kind of stuff is very useful, very approachable, very cost conscious for a lot of beginner smiths. But what it ends up doing is it can look wrinkled, it can look thin. And that's something that people, as they become more adept at working metal, they start to get away from. And so that's why I think the next step for a goldsmith or a jeweler or what have you is to get into heavy bezels, or that more professional look where it looks more substantial. You're moving metal instead of just pushing metal. And I love them. I set them all the time. That's what all my work is. That's what I teach all my students, including my beginners. We don't use bezel wire at my school. Yeah. Okay, so back to the question at hand. What do we do with corners? And so my tip for corners on heavy bezels is you start with that piece of wire, and you're gonna set up a pair of L shapes, if that makes sense. We're gonna like that. And in these corner webs of what we would start with our original stock is I'm gonna use a saw and saw 75% of the way through that piece of wire, and then do a little bend, and then you've got like a very wide angle. And so then I saw 75% away again, and then I bring it in, and then I do it again. And then by that point, we're usually at like a 90-degree corner. And when I've got two pairs of 90-degree corners, I take these short ends and I make sure that they're matched to the stone. Because usually when we're doing a corner, we're talking about a square or a rectangle. Now, let me hold off a second on your odd shapes, your pairs, your triangles, all those. So what I would do once I have that pair of corners is I'd make these my short ends or my long ends, kind of depending on how you've decided to do it. It's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. But the other end should be extending further past the actual length of your stone. And I match those up and I make a little mark right here and right here to show me where I'm going to solder those together. And so those opposite corners are not sawn, they're soldered. Once we get past that stage and we have our frame, right, our rectangular or square frame, solder it onto a plate, install a step bezel, whatever our method is, then I trim off those edges, you know, and everything looks perfect. Now, when it actually gets to soldering or stone setting the squares, my main trick is that I take, I chamfer my whole thing. And what chamfering means is if you have a bezel wall, it's made out of rectangle wire, so it has a thickness to it. And that thickness is that 1 millimeter that we were talking about. And what I'll end up doing is cutting a 45-degree angle on that. So kind of looks like a wide edge. And the trick for squares and corners and stuff is that I also, naturally, when you're filing, you're going to get that kind of pyramidal style 45-degree angle that's coming together in the corners. And that looks great when you're finished setting. But to get to that place, if you started doing that, that's actually a lot of extra metal that's in your way trying to delicately trap the stone. And so I file my 45-degree angle also on the corners to thin that out. And when I start setting my stone, I start there and I just work from both corners. I hammer a little bit this way and I hammer a little bit this way. And I trap my 4 corners opposites. And then I work from the corners in towards the center to kind of iron it out. And that tends to be the best way of getting those corners in there. If I was going to be doing a pear shape, I'd probably do the same thing, where I would come around with my wire and get that pointed end. And I would let them, if it works out, I would let them come together at a more right angle, right? And clean it up that way. But if it's a much steeper angle, you may have to do a little filing instead of sawing to get that point. But usually you can do the saw method to get that tight angle and work your way around. And then what I would do is I would put my joint at the big fat end instead of the top. But as you get kind of better, you can manipulate the wire so that you can put your solder joint wherever you want. And I usually match my solder joints up from the point where I'm going to be putting a bail or I'm going to be attaching it to a ring, that sort of thing. So if I was going to do a pear shape where the point is the bottom of my pendant and the big fat end is at the top, that's where I'd put my joint. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. Meredith asks, how's my day today? It's good. I've been having a good day. We decided to expand the school, so very exciting. We are adding 300 more square feet, so it's a second room onto our space, and I'm super pumped about that. But what that means is there's been a lot of navigating where we're going to put things, and one of those things included putting in a new rug today. So we moved every single piece of our benches of our school and put a rug underneath. Now, why would you put a rug in a studio where you're dropping little things and you could lose your stones and it's going to collect metal? And I wouldn't suggest a rug for most studios, but the cement floor in our space is kind of crumbly in a sense. And so we were getting a lot of dust that was really kind of counterintuitive to having that clean floor space. So we opted to put a big area rug over that to kind of protect ourselves from that extra dust. And what I'll actually probably notice is that the stones will bounce less, and If I try to pick up a soft stone like an aquamarine or something off the cement floor, it won't scrape. So I've got a lot of philosophies on different flooring styles. I would much prefer some kind of crappy seamless laminate wood floor, you know, like I wouldn't call it crappy. It's very expensive and that's why I didn't put it in. But that's what I would prefer. But I'm just not entirely sure about how I want the flooring in my space to look yet. So I'm not ready to invest. So the rug is a nice short-term but super helpful way to get the place the way I want it for now. And what we're going to be doing is, for the longest time, our studio has been both our kind of office space and our school space. So we have 5 student benches where you guys can learn, and then we have our couch and our meeting space all in that one room, but it was feeling a little tight. And so we've decided to take on another room to make our office, and then we'll keep our workshop. So we'll have like a clean and a dirty workshop space. So the photography and the computers and the laser welder can go in one room, and we will have our polishing and our soldering and our filing happen in the other room. I just want to check in. Welcome everybody who's joined while I was chit-chatting about that last question. If anybody else has questions, you can put it in the chat or just speak up, and I'll kind of touch on things that people have asked and kind of go back and forth between what I can remember people wondering about and what you guys are asking as I'm talking. So one of the questions I got a lot while I was trying to teach people online was how to make, like, how do you set these things, right? So a heavy bezel, because of its thickness, we were talking about that, that chamfered edge makes it a little thinner at the top, but still keeps that big, bold look, right? When I'm setting these, as opposed to if I was going to be setting a thin bezel or a bezel wire, usually you're doing that with like a rocking situation or a hammer handpiece. I would probably more often than not never use a hammer handpiece or a bezel pusher for a heavy bezel. What I'm going to be using is a steel punch made out of a 10-penny nail. You can buy them at Home Depot or whatever your local hardware store is. They're like a pretty durable steel construction nail. And what I like to do is I cut off the head of the nail and I cut off the tip of the nail. And then I start kind of filing and shaping the tip into a useful hammering tool called a punch. And those things can be shaped kind of however you want them to be. They could be textured if you want your bezels to always have the same texture. That's one of my favorite things to do, is do textured bezels, where I've kind of turned them into a matting tool, which is a type of texturing tool. Or you can make them round or rectangular or square or oval. And once you have that little punch face, that's what you're going to be pushing over your bezel with. And so when I'm going to set that heavy bezel, I start with like a north, south, east, west setting so that I'm getting the 4 points that kind of tighten it like a prong, right? And then once I know my stone is in, that's when I start working with those cross sections and putting the rest of it down. And with a punch, what you're going to be using is a chasing hammer to tap, tap, tap that bezel down. And so it's a very mechanical, human mechanical thing. You're just kind of working with the metal, you're watching it move, you're hammering. And I really enjoy that because it's very much, I'm part of that process. I'm watching the metal move. I can like be a little harder or a little softer with my hammer blows if I think that the stone is delicate or it needs just a little bit of a touch. And that's how, you can really control hammer setting something as soft as an opal or a sea glass or a beach pebble, something soft and breakable like lapis can kind of be scary when you're talking about taking this hammer and this punch right up next to it and going, I'm just gonna tap, 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 tap and hammer the stone. But because you're feeling that response between, oh, the metal's not moving anymore, or I have to hit harder around this corner, you can really control how it is that you are interacting with that process. And so I feel like you get a lot more control once you're doing it all with your body, right? So I have an IGTV on the school page, the Marquis Jewelry Academy page, where you guys can see how I make those tools a little bit more clearly. I use diamond wheels at my bench. They're a little expensive, but they're kind of worthwhile to have in the shop because you can use them for so many things. Once you get further along in your stone setting process, you can use them for cleaning up your gravers. A lot of people do bright cutting. So that's cutting the inside rim that goes down against the stone. So when we're talking about this bezel wall, you have the wall, you have the chamfered edge, you have the top that you're going to hammer down. And that little rim that just touches the stone, some people cut or burnish the face of that so that it shines, because it's a lot harder to polish and clean up near your stone once it's fully set. A clarification question about bezel corners. What's up?
Okay, sorry, I was trying to type and then break up a kid fight at the same time, and I was really behind. Okay, so when you were talking about, I think you were first talking about a square bezel, and you were talking about taking two pieces, right? And you're filing that corner.
That shape, yeah.
And you said you use your saw, not your needle files. Is that correct?
Correct. Yep.
Correct. Okay.
So my method is definitely using the saw because I feel like I have just that much more control over the fineness of my angles, right? I can have any angle with my saw, but if I'm using a file, I kind of got to gauge where I'm headed and how much material I'm pulling away. And you actually have to pull away a lot more material before you can check, right? If you were working your way to 75% with a triangular file or a square file, you're kind of forced to the triangle or the square. Whereas if you're doing it with a saw, you are constantly closing that angle in and in, more so that you have control over it. And when you're dealing with non-calibrated stones from wherever, having that little level of control really kind of opens it up for you.
So you cut with the saw and then you fold it a little bit until your metal touches again. Mm-hmm. And then you cut a little bit more in that folded position, and then you fold a little more, and you just keep doing it almost like a ratchet until you get to where you want to be. Right.
And then when I'm where I want to be, I flow some solder in there.
That was my next question. Do you float solder into your seams for your where your corners are?
I tend to do that because it gives me a lot more stability. Let's say I needed to make a heavy bezel for something like a hexagon instead of a rectangle. I would be doing this method, and as I worked my way around, you might feel that it gets a little fragile as you get ahead of yourself in, right? You're on your fifth one. So if you take a break and solder some of those up, now you have this rigid angular piece, and you can kind of keep working your way ahead. A lot of times when I'm teaching techniques to my students, I'm not thinking about, okay, they want to make a round cabochon set. They want to make a square set. I'm trying to give them these skills in a sense where they're never limited. If they come across a stone in the wild, they know, oh, I know how to set this because there's a couple techniques on how to make this bezel. And I've got, you know, this option that will cover any angle, right? Versus just the one.
Mm-hmm. So my last little tag on question with that is, when you're soldering, so now you have solder in your filed seams, and then you have solder when you put those two pieces together. Do you ever find that to be a hindrance when it comes to, like, when you're chamfering the edges and pushing the metal over, that solder ever getting in the way or causing any issues?
No, I would say that the solder really doesn't impact that, especially when you're using a hammer and a punch. The solder is not so rigid that you couldn't work that down. And it also usually doesn't reflow. So a couple of things, let's step back and unload that question a little bit. When we're talking about solder, we have multiple levels of an alloy to the metal that we're using, right? So in the case of making a sterling silver bezel, you have hard, medium, easy, extra easy solder. And what I like to teach is to use hard solder as much as possible until you're getting to maybe the last solder joint or the most difficult, you know, funny, delicate solder joint. And that's when I would begin to use medium. Now, as you're learning to practice using hard solder for all of your joints on one piece, that might be really difficult, learning how to balance the heat so that your seams don't run or flow or, you know, cause trouble. And the way that they all work is they've got different melting temperatures, right? So your hard has the closest melting temperature to your sterling silver. And then your medium has the next closest melting temp to the hard. And the idea is that you have these to be used as an aid for when you're starting to get more complicated. But a lot of people tend to kind of just use medium or easy on everything when they're learning because it flows quicker, you're less likely to melt stuff. But what that's actually doing is it's not teaching you to understand the range of melting temperature that metal has to your best fabrication benefit. So to come back around, when I'm using hard solder, because it's got an alloy in it that's keeping it kind of a little lower melting temperature than silver, that little alloy is a harder metal. And so what that means is it doesn't want to move as easy. So in theory, if I'm working with corners and I have this hard solder in there, is the corner going to set as easily? But we're talking about such little amount of solder in there. We're not flooding this thing. We're just trying to get enough solder in there so that it's closed right. I don't find that to be impactful when I'm trying to set the stone. Does that answer that question? So our next question is, why do I not use a hammer hand piece? Okay, so let's talk about hammer hand pieces. There is a tool that you can buy. I think predominantly the most popular tool is from Fordham that can go onto your Fordham flex shaft. And what happens is as the rotary spins, it causes a kick, right? And that kick is that hammer. And when you have that hammer kick, you're able to impact things with it. And they're very useful, but they're also not incredibly strong. If you're working with bezel wire or you're working with something delicate, it's very much strong enough. But once you start to increase the thickness of your wire, or thickness of your bezel wall, I find that it's just not really strong enough to push that over, the metal over to the point where it's actually going to be tight and trap that stone there. So I do think that if anybody is fortunate enough to have a pneumatic graver or a pneumatic piece like a GRS Graver Max, you can make those little punches that can go in the pneumatic pieces, and they tend to have strong enough kick where you can hammer a piece over, but you can dial those things in so that they could blow through just about anything you wanted. But I think that the hammer hand piece, I usually only use it when I'm setting stones that are in like the 3 millimeter or less size. And usually I'm not using a heavy bezel on those. I'm using something a little bit more delicate. That's just because I maybe started with a tube or I started with something a little bit thinner. And I feel like I can have that control that way. I do use my hammer hand piece for other things. I absolutely love it for texturing. So a lot of times I'm not likely to have just a clean bezel. Well, that's a lie. Love, love, love high polished, clean bezel on my pendants. But often when I'm doing ones in silver, usually there's a big back plate on there. There's a lot of bezel material, and I enjoy the play of having some texture and some high polish. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll use the point or the diamond tip on my hammer handpiece, and I'll use that to texture my whole surface after I've set my stone. And that really gives that like gritty, yummy, glittery look, especially great for trapping bits of liver or sulfur in there and getting that like high, low, dark, light play in there. But yeah, hammer handpiece just tends not to translate as well when you're working with that 1mm bezel. So that's why I tend to use the punch. Do we have any questions? If anybody is asking, I did have some people ask when I showed like my tools of the trade little image. It was just a bunch of the tools that I use when I'm making heavy bezels. A handful of people asked me what the magic polishing wand was in the corner. So that's just my flex shaft, my Fordham flex shaft with a polishing buff in it, but removed from the flex shaft. So for those of you guys who don't have a Fordham or aren't hyper familiar with it, even though you do have one, the handles come off, right? So traditionally they come with the handpiece that's kind of thick, and then it has the teeth and the chuck key that open and close that little mouth, right? The chuck. And very helpful, very approachable. What's great about that is you can get whatever size mandrel or wire or whatever you want to put in there. But you can swap it out for something like the quick change handpiece, which only works with the 3/32 mandrels, or you can swap it out for the hammer handpiece. And so really versatile tool when you're looking at adding a bunch of options to kind of your polishing and texturing, and without increasing your overhead too significantly. I think most of the additional hand pieces are in the $150 to $200 range, and I advise them. They're really fantastic, and they can take you a long way while you're learning and growing. Even though I'm advising that you could use a pneumatic graver for your stone setting, I don't have one. I've been trained on them. I've had access to them over the last 15 years, but I haven't gotten one for myself because it's just a big investment, and I can set stones with a hammer and a punch. So for now, it stays to the side, right? But it's definitely a very exciting tool as you grow. If you're into engraving, if you're into very fine stone setting, if you want to get into things like cutting fish tails and all of those fancy beads and the stars. And once you start to get into looking at faceted stones set into very fancy ways, usually gravers are involved, and they're all cut and cleaned in certain ways to make those really beautiful cuts, right? Very exciting method to get into, but definitely not an introductory sort of technique. Another question we got was kind of just how to form, our heavy bezels. So I think I'll take a step back and talk about how I form a heavy bezel. So when I'm taking my wire, I got your question, Ian. I'll get back to that in a second. When I'm taking a piece of heavy bezel wire, I usually start with a little bit more than I'm estimating that I need. I try not to have that, 4 feet of silver wire hanging off my bench, or, however much, especially with gold, you want to kind of use a guesstimate because you don't want to buy more than you really need. When I'm going to start making my bezel, my main tool is going to be my half-round plier. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to file my wire to be a square butted end, and I'm going to kind of pick a spot on my stone, probably where I'm going to attach a ring shank or bail or what have you. And I'm going to take my half-round plier and just start forming my wire along the edge of my bezel, very similarly to how I would imagine somebody would do it with a piece of bezel wire, except there's less just excuse me, there's less just pushing it against, and you actually have to twist and form with your pliers. And what I do is I just kind of work my way around the bezel. And a lot of times I teach people for their first stone on a free form, or I teach them on a round, but I'm doing the same technique because somebody could do this with a round stone, they could do it with an oval stone, cushion cut stone, just kind of whatever you're looking for. And I'm going to just kind of form my way around and just millimeter by millimeter work my way all the way around that bezel until I'm almost to the other end. And when I get them, they're usually your two pieces of wire kind of come together like this. This is your original butt end, and this is the flap of extra material. And what I do, and I can draw this for somebody if they were really curious, but I look at that inside point, right? So there's a corner, right? There's a square rectangular edge of my wire, and the inside point is the one that's closest to the stone, right? And I imagine if that point drew a line across a 90-degree angle across my remaining wire, that's the line I would saw off. And then when you kind of bring that back down and in, they have that perfect butted end for soldering. When it comes to soldering heavy bezels, what I do often is capillary soldering. So what that means is I put a little piece of solder at the bottom and I heat up both sides of my bezel and draw it up. Capillary works by pulling the liquid solder through the tight seam. The other method for something much, much bigger or thicker, like a big thick ring, would be tension soldering. And that's where you shove a piece of solder in between the seam and then make it flow. I find that with most 1x3 or 1x4 millimeter wire, you can get away with capillary soldering, and that will do just fine for silver or gold. Ian asks, what would you recommend for a surface treatment for a new or used jewelry bench? Gonna need a little bit more info. I wouldn't treat a bench, really. I mean, you could probably do a little linseed oil if it wasn't already coated with something, like say you were building your own bench. I would just do a coat of linseed oil to make it look a little fuller, right? It gives wood that fuller body. But aside from just soap and water or linseed oil, boiled linseed oil, I wouldn't do much to a jewelry bench. I think that they are, they're such work surfaces and they need to be kind of cleaned occasionally and fussed with. And I think that they're usually just fine as raw wood because you're gonna scratch into them, you're probably gonna draw on it, you're gonna hammer something into it a couple times. So I'm not sure if you have a more specific question outside of that, but that's what I would do. Soap and water or boiled linseed oil. I wouldn't stain it or anything unless you're really trying to go for a look. Meredith asks, what backplate thickness options do I use, and does it vary depending on the stone, size, pendant, earring, ring, etc.? So I usually stock 20 gauge for my bezel plates if I'm using that 1 millimeter wire. For me, I think 20 gauge is usually quite thick enough. Sorry, somebody just checked in on Instagram, so I wanted to make sure they weren't trying to hop into the chat. So when I'm trying to just make a plate for the back of something, if I'm building a pendant, if I'm doing the back of a ring, 20 gauge for me is quite substantial enough without being too heavy. If I was using gold, I might go to 22 gauge, maybe. Usually if I'm working with gold, I'm going to use a tapered back or a step bezel back to help with minimizing the amount of space, weight, surface area of gold that I'm using, because it really matters how much something weighs, because it really increases the cost of your item. When you're working with sterling silver or you were working with another metal, you can usually get away with just using 20 gauge material. For earrings, I might use something a little thinner like 22. I still would not go much thinner than that because you can start to get warping, especially on bigger pieces. A lot of times when people are using bezel wire and, you know, they're using very thin materials, and those thin materials are so easily affected by the heat when you're doing your soldering that they begin to bend and warp. And then all of a sudden, you've tried to put a bezel on something and the whole thing looks like the pool cover in the middle of the winter. And you're like, how did this happen? I started with flat material. So I think that, you know, that comes from the way that everything's kind of annealing and forming, and it was under such tension before, and then it kind of irons out. So usually if I'm going to do something in 22 gauge, I'm talking smaller, usually smaller than a dime probably. If I'm getting bigger than a nickel, I'll probably use 20 gauge for whatever I'm doing. Would I go thicker than that, or is 20 gauge as thick as I'd go? Yeah, I think if I was doing something more substantial to forming the piece that the bezel's going on, so let's say I was making a thick anti-clastic cuff with bezels on it in the recess. So anti-clastic is that dual form curve, right? So think about a Pringle, that's anti-clastic, and they can be used to make really fun cuffs. They can be used to make earrings. They can be applied in a bunch of fun ways. But it's actually a very complicated thing to get a bezel fit to, but if you're into that kind of attention to detail and puzzle making in your work, it might be super enjoyable. So let's say I was going to make a big, thick anti-clastic cuff. I might want to go up as high as 16 gauge to create that piece, or I might be working on a cuff that's made out of 4mm thick wire and need to solder a bezel onto it. I think if I'm going to go thicker than 20 gauge, I'm going to be using it for its form and its substance. It's at that point that I'm going, I need this to be strong. I need it to be substantial. I need this to hold its shape. And that's why I'm going to be using something so much thicker. If you're really just putting the back of a stone on something, if you're just trying to make the bezel have somewhere to sit, 20 gauge is incredibly sufficient. Trying to think. Somebody asked online how to fuse a gold bezel. It's a good question. Now, when it comes to fusing, that's really a fine silver, fine gold, or 22 karat gold discussion. Can you fuse things that are sterling? Can you fuse things that are 18 karat or 14 karat? Yes, you can. So let's talk about fusing, because apparently Meredith's having her mind blown. So fusing is when you are taking the two pieces of metal and you're bringing them up to the same temperature. And instead of introducing that solder alloy, you are just getting them to flow. And a fuse is similar to a weld in that sense. There's no additional material. There's only the original alloy. This can be very helpful if you don't want somebody to see your solder seams on your bezel in 15 years. This is very helpful if you are really worried about that alloy difference. But many people don't do it with just normal stone setting. I think that you've got to want that attention to detail. Many people do fine silver for their bezel settings. I use sterling. Many people like to use 22 karat for their bezel settings. I use 14 and 18. But if you were going to be fusing, essentially what you do is you get your bezel together and you get that butt end, right? So those 2 points that are coming together, and you're going to heat this piece up. I don't want to say to the melting point, but it's very red, much more red than you would get it if you were just doing a traditional soldering. And then you begin to kind of feather the flame. So instead of that soldering where you're have your heat on there and you're going back and forth to make sure both sides are coming up to temperature. Instead, you're going to kind of like feather, almost tickle the metal with that flame tip. So when we're talking about a flame, right, you've got the torch bit, you've got that electric blue cone, which is really just a cone. It's not your hot spot. You've got the space right in front of the cone, which is certainly incredibly hot. And then you've got that like darker navy blue flame that's going on. And then sometimes at the very end, if it's a bushy flame, that's what they would call it, a bushy flame, it's a little orange. So what I would do if I was doing 22 karat or fine silver is I'd bring it up to that redder orangey space. And then when your seam is kind of like glowing in a way that the rest of the thing isn't glowing, it's essentially a lot more hot. That's when you start to kind of feather and tickle. And what's going to end up happening is that seam just gets so hot that it begins to fuse together. And instead of introducing a solder, you just create a butted end. It takes a lot of practice, and I wouldn't recommend doing it on a client's piece that you have to rush on because you may melt it a couple times. And I probably wouldn't do it with heavy bezels, although you probably could with gold. I wouldn't do it with, well, no, you could probably do it. I just don't know why you would do it, is the question. It's a very complicated thing. As somebody who doesn't do it, I wouldn't. But if you wanted to, I think you could. I think that fusing like 22 karat gold rings, that's really the way to go. Often when you're making 22 karat jewelry, you don't want to introduce a lower melting alloy because it's kind of taking away the purity of the reason why you use that metal in the first place. So often when somebody's making something out of 22 karat or 14 karat gold, they're going to be using only 22 karat or 24 karat to fuse the entire piece together. So very cool technique. Takes a lot of practice, but it can be done for just about whatever reason that you're looking to apply it. And doing a 22 karat bezel is definitely one of those. A great way to introduce gold into your work if you are using a lot of silver and you're like, I'm gold curious. I kind of want to know what this is like. It's wicked expensive. I don't want to know what it's like anymore. What I teach a lot of my students when they're doing their first bezel is taking gold as the bezel and putting it on a silver backplate. It's a very common way to cut out the cost of that backplate also being gold, but also give yourself that pop of color and the contrast that comes along with gold. I teach my students a 14 karat bezel on silver, but I do find that a lot of fine jewelers will do 22 karat on a silver backplate. And in that case, they'd probably be fusing that bezel and then soldering it to the backplate with silver solder. Really, really smart way to start adding gold to your work, raising that price point if you're looking to sell it, and also play with the color that happens. You know, when you get to have yellow wrapped around a blue stone instead of silver, you're going to get a totally different, exciting emotion out of that stone, right? So when you're talking about how you're going to design something and what that means, a yellow metal might be a whole different vibe than a white metal or a pink metal. So I highly advise playing, and that's one of the ways that I would do that. One of the things that I like to do when people kind of asked about this is other types of bezels, right? So we have the traditional bezel. So that's just a straight wall on a back plate. So that's what we've been talking about this whole time. But just earlier I was talking about how to cut down on weight, right? So let's say your stone is absolutely gorgeous, beautiful on the front as it is on the back. It's translucent and you want that light play to come through the earrings. Maybe it's got a carving on the back like my scarabs do, and you want to show that off. There's two different methods to creating an open back bezel. One of them is a step bezel, which I'll talk about first, and then the other is a tapered bezel, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Step bezels are when you have that flat wall, and instead of a whole back plate along the back, you just have a little rim. And there's two ways to do that. I think one is a little bit more challenging than the other, but it's also less wasteful when we're talking about material costs. So the first way that you could do it is you could solder your piece onto a plate and then saw out the inside, either into a shape, into multiple shapes, into a very tiny rim, maybe 1 millimeter extended in would be plenty. That would be, you know, the sawing method to create a step bezel. So your step bezel is really just a plate that's been sawn away. The way that I like to do it, because I'm not sawing as much and I'm not throwing away as much, I'm not putting as much waste into my my recycling bin, my refining bins, right? What I like to do is I use 1 millimeter or 0.75 millimeter square wire. And depending on the size of the piece or the substantial need of the piece, I would use the thicker or the thinner. If I was doing earrings, I might use the 0.75. If I was doing a ring or a pendant, I'd probably use the 1 millimeter just to kind of give it that strength. And what ends up happening is you build your bezel. So let's say you made, what shape is this? Okay, let's say you made a circle. If you made a circle, then you would make a circle that ran just inside, right? And you would solder that thing in so it kind of looked like a little L bracket, right? So you have a little L that pops in, and that's in the bottom of your stone. And it's gonna give you just enough support underneath your bezel. If for some reason you wanted to elevate a stone in your bezel because you had made a traditional bezel, but then you found out that it was too tall in accident, you could also make a step bezel and just place it inside to rise up your stone a little. So what I do is I make that inner bezel, that inner ring, and I make sure that it's tightly, snugly fit into my bezel wall. And then I flow solder all the way around so that I have this bottom that's perfectly matched to the rest of it. No sawing, no filing, no fussing. And then I can just file the back of that nice and clean, or I can texture it, or I can be really, really good at soldering and let it be a detail because it's so perfect. So that's a challenge for you right there, is make a step bezel that looks perfect so that you don't have to clean it up. So I really like that method for doing pendants because I get to have the lighter weight, not so much material that's holding my neck down. I also you find if you're doing like a bigger bezel pendant, you're doing a bigger stone, that thing flips on you, you know. Somebody may be moving around and all of a sudden the front of their pendant is facing themselves and the back of the pendant is facing out. And so you may want to make sure that your stone looks good from both ends. And exposing the stone with a step bezel is a really great way to add that design element where even an accident looks on purpose, right? So very helpful, very lightweight, doesn't take up as much material, doesn't have as much waste. If I was going to be doing an open back for maybe like a ring or a pendant that I wanted some kind of more exciting shape to, that's usually when I will work with a tapered bezel. Now, tapered bezels can be very difficult in the sense that they take a little bit more calculation once you've done your measurements or you've made your shape. To get that tapered form, you either need to do kind of like a layout on your sheet metal to bring it up and around. We're not going to talk about that method. That's way too in depth for a Zoom call. But I could talk about it if somebody had a more intense question about that down the road. What I do prefer to do for all of my, what I'd call regular shapes, so your rounds, your ovals, pears, cushions, emeralds, kind of all those, you know, if it comes in a diamond shape, then they probably have a bezel block for it. And so what bezel blocks are they are these steel anvil-y stake things, right? They're made of the same material that you would find those tools in. And each one of them would be a specific shape. So let's say we're talking about the oval one. An oval one is a big oval versus a small oval. And each one of those ovals is usually at like a 17-degree angle, CNC'd out this taper that is that form. And it's in various shapes that you might find your cabochons in. Maybe it's a 8x6 or a 10x8 or a 12x10, right? Very traditional oval shape. And what you do is you can take your flat bezel wall, that bezel that you've created, and you can hammer it into the cone shape. And what ends up happening is your walls kind of compress and taper down, and then they flare up at the top a little bit. And now you have that 17-degree tapered form. So when you're looking at it from the exterior, it's got that really beautiful cut edge. If you wanted to stack other stones next to it, if you wanted to put it into a band, it also has that open bottom so that you could clean the stone, you can have the lighter weight. And then the next step after doing that, after applying it to whatever piece, giving it a bail, giving it a shank, whatever your design step is, usually what you would do is take a round burr and cut around the inside, like a millimeter to 2 millimeters down from the inside edge. You'd make a rim and essentially cut a little seat, right? So you're cutting a little round spot, and that's where the stone is gonna click in, and then you set the wall over the top. I have another IGTV video on how to use those tools. They're a lot of fun. You can get them from AutoFry. There's an extensive list of Italian bezel blocks that they have. I think that having a round and having an oval is a really nice investment once you start setting a lot of stones, because it kind of eases how difficult remaking and making again those pieces are, and using that tapered edge really kind of elevates the design that you're doing, right? It's not just a square edge, it's not just a flat item. Now it's got form. And when we start talking about form, that's kind of when we start getting into that more elevated jewelry design. Do we have any more questions, anybody? I know I've just talked a lot, but I'm kind of here in case anybody has any queries from beginner to these more advanced topics. I'm just going to take a quick check and see if there was my fiance told me that I need a whiteboard. I don't know if I'm prepared to draw on a whiteboard in a mirror situation, but I can practice that for next time. I touched on that. Oh, okay. So somebody asked about jet ballistic versus jet basic, and what is that? What is that stuff? So when I'm stone setting, often what I'm using is Thermolock, which is a different proprietary brand of jet basic. And what these two items are, one's from GRS, one is from Rio Grande. They are thermoplastic. So what that means is it is a plastic that is hard enough to be structurally strong, but when you heat it up with hot water or a heat gun or a microwave, it becomes soft and malleable. So you can change whatever the shape is of this material, build a strong structure, and then use that once it's cooled to support your stone setting. So very, very helpful in a handful of different ways. And so I want to just take a kind of step back and talk about how you can use it, and then we'll talk about which brands and why. So there's a couple different ways that you could support this material once you've heated it up and shaped it, and you still can't just put it on the counter, right? You need to put it in something strong so that it doesn't just fly away on you while you start setting. So what I would do is you can either shape it so that it goes into the jaws of a vise. Many people have a vise in their studio, either a huge one that's like kind of industrial, right? A lot of people, that's kind of their first go, is something between like a 4 and 6 inch vise that you might find in a mechanic shop. You could put it in there, tighten it up, let it cool, tighten it up a little tighter, and it will hold that piece of plastic, and you can do whatever work it is that you have to do. It's very helpful if you need to do some intensive filing. It's very helpful if you have to do your hammer setting. Then if you start to invest in your tools a little bit more, you may have a benchmate or a multi-purpose vise or a stone setting vise. And those are kind of more fixed to your bench situations. I know a lot of people invest in a benchmate, which is a GRS tool that is kind of like a ring clamp on crack. So you go back 30 years, every jeweler before the benchmate existed was using a ring clamp. And what that is it's a piece of, 2 pieces of wood that are on a hinge, and you put a wedge in there and it tightens and holds the thing that you're trying to work on, like a, you know, a strong little vise made out of wood. And a lot of times you would see there was a little curve cut out of older bench pins. And that would be so that the non-dominant hand could hold the ring clamp against the bench, and the dominant hand could do the work on whatever that piece was. GRS comes out with this fantastical item that mounts to your bench, and it's kind of mechanical and has multi points of pivot and tightens up with a mechanical twist instead of a wedge, so it's less likely to come loose on you. And so a lot of people, when they're getting into jewelry making, will buy one of those because it's a very approachable tool, very clearly has purpose. It also helps you build up hand strength when maybe you don't have it at an introductory level. So what you can do is you can either put your thermoplastic into that little mouth that opens and closes to hold things, or you can remove that altogether and just put it into the place that would hold the benchmate's ring clamp section. It's kind of hard to explain if you don't exactly know what I'm talking about, but I'm happy to show anybody on a side video if they're really looking to figure that technique out. So that's one way that you could hold the thermoplastic, is within your benchmate. If you have a multi-purpose vise or a bench vise or anything else, you would do that just the same way as you would do with your mechanics vise. Put the thermoplastic in there, tighten it up. Usually it'll cool and it'll shrink a little, and you'll have to tighten a little further. But then you'll also have that really great, heavy, supportive place to do your work. So that's the thermoplastic. You could also probably form it around various items if you were trying to do some more complicated work. I've used it around a bracelet mandrel to put a cuff or a bracelet onto a bracelet mandrel so that I could then do chasing and repoussé into it, or do some stone setting into it. It's just a kind of a funny, you know, you've got that malleable plastic that lets you put something onto something else and hold it there affixed. I've also used it to put rings onto discs, like a big thick fat washer, so that I could do texturing or chasing or stone setting around the outside of the ring. So I found a handful of ways to use the thermoplastic. It's just nice to have kind of in a problem solving way. It's one of those tools that you can go, oh, I can use it like this. So Jamie says, I have jet ballistic and I find it's really tough to heat up and reuse again. Is it intended to be reusable? Dipping it in hot water doesn't seem to soften it enough. Michelle says, basically plastic we all played with in the 90s. And the person who is asking the question says, she bought jet ballistic versus jet basic. She's intimidated and doesn't really know, you know, what's the difference and why. So let's unwrap all that. I tend to use Thermolock, which is the gray thermoplastic from GRS. So I'm going to talk from that point of view on how I use it. If my piece is kind of huge or needs a lot of reshaping or has been sitting around for a long time, I will toss it into the microwave for 15-second blasts until it has become malleable. You have to be careful because it can be burning freaking hot. They sell a sheet of some kind of frictionless plastic that is very helpful. I just scrape it off the bottom of my microwave because it's not really a food microwave, it's more of a shop microwave. 6 of one, half a dozen the other, I guess. They all do the same thing. But once you have that stuff from the microwave, you can really form and shape it into kind of the way that you're always going to use it. So I like to have mine be kind of like a T where I've got the flat spot up here where I'm going to put my stone, and this is the part that goes into my vise. So typically once I have it in that shape, I'm going to kind of leave it like that. And then what I use is a heat gun that we always kind of have plugged in. And I use the heat gun just to heat up that top surface, just to add and remove and shift around my thermoplastic however I need to use it. And I'm going to use a combination of either my hands, a bench knife, or pliers to kind of move around that plastic and remove pieces, depending on how hot or how big something was that needs to be adjusted. The water method, I have been caught on here before saying I don't like it because it's wet. I really don't enjoy using the hot water method to adjust the thermoplastics because I feel like there is an entire drying process and the water bubbles can get caught inside the plastics. And all right, now I'm getting hazed in the chat. This is good. Water is wet. Yep. So in my opinion, if you guys are having a tough time with the jet ballistic or the jet basic, I might try to use a heat gun and see if that helps you. I can't speak to this jet ballistic product. I'll follow up in the kind of the comment section of the YouTube page if I kind of have a more substantial opinion on the differences between those materials. I'll do a little research so that I can say, this is good for this is good for this, or this doesn't work for this way. So if anybody is looking to use those thermoplastics for their stone setting, which I highly recommend because it's very useful, I would opt for the Thermolock from GRS. It's gray, not white. I don't know if that's a turnoff. You know, if you want everything to look clean, or, you know, the dirty gray plastic looks very industrial. So sometimes it's like, oh, I don't know, it's not, you know, clean and pretty. It's all silly to me. I just think the Thermolock is a better product for me. We had a question. I'm finding the inner rim is looking a little rough and looks a bit chewed up after setting with the hammer and the punch. Might this mean I'm not leaving enough of an inner edge on the chamfer? How large of the metal thickness should I leave when I'm chamfering? Good question. So we were talking about this before, Meredith. The inner edge, as you kind of get further along in your stone setting process, can be cleaned up a couple ways. If you leave a thick enough edge, let's say you're using 1 millimeter wire, let's say you leave 1/3 of that, or 0.33 not chamfered. Okay, eyeball it. You don't have to measure it. That's insane. You leave a third of it unchamfered on that top edge. That might be thick enough so that when you push it over and set it with your hammer punch, it's not wavy and wrinkly. But often what ends up happening is the further you get along in your process, the more interested you are in bright cutting or burnishing. There's two kind of ways to do that and 2 points at which you can do that. So if I'm just kind of quickly doing a piece, I don't want to spend an insane amount of time on it, I might use a carbide burnisher. A burnisher being a piece of steel, carbide, the type of steel, and use the carbide burnisher to rub that inner edge before I set the stone. So to kind of create that bright burnished spot that will be pushed up against my stone. I'm also work hardening it in that process. When you're burnishing, you are rubbing one metal against another metal and creating a work hardened area on your piece. So that will also kind of minimize the amount of wrinkling happening because it's a stronger, harder edge. I think that if you are not incredibly good with gravers, if you don't have access to gravers, buying a carbide burnisher and putting that in a little graver handpiece is a very approachable way to begin cleaning up that inner edge if that's a concern. Once you get more adept at stone setting, more along on your process of how to adjust and fuss with, and that's when you might want to start introducing bright cutting. Bright cutting, you're taking a flat graver, and a graver is a piece of steel shaped into whatever the shape is that it's called. So a flat graver is kind of like a plow wedge shape with a little heel, which would be this kind of tiny angle down bottom that allows the graver to have lift and cut, right? So you take a graver and you push it along that inner edge, and what ends up happening is it cuts a little spiral of that material away. And in its wake, because you have a highly polished tool, it's leaving a bright cut in its path. Before, when we were talking about those fancy styles of stone setting, we were talking about those bright cuts, those bright passes. So the bright cut ends up being that really bright inner edge of your stone. And as you go to set the stone, unless you've slipped, that bright edge should be that part that goes right up against your cabochon or your faceted stone. If you are very practiced, if you have a microscope like a Leica, you might want to hammer your bezel down. Let's say you're going to do 2 or 3 passes before the stone is fully set. After my first pass or after my second, depending on how far I got the bezel to come down onto the stone, I might go in with my bright cutter and do it right there. But what you're doing is you kind of have to balance not dipping the edge of your super hard steel tool into the surface of your stone, scraping away whatever that is, because even if you had a sapphire, if you were using a very hard piece of steel or a carbide graver, you could just scrape the facets right off that thing. So it's one of those things that kind of takes practice and time, but you'll find that a lot of higher end jewelers do get to the place where they could do their bright cutting as almost the last step or the second to last step before cleaning up and polishing. So these are things that, you know, we're talking from a beginners to advanced scope of steps and how you can add these skills to the work that you're making. So if at any point the things that I'm talking about kind of seem over your head, you just come back to these kind of concepts as you get further along and revisit it and go, oh, I understand how I would apply that, or, oh, I'm ready to study that technique now. I'm ready to practice this. And a lot of the times when I'm practicing these things, I'm not doing them on clients' work. I'm practicing them on stuff I'm going to give my sister or my mother or throw in a bucket and not look at forever. You'll find that a lot of jewelers have a whole pile of stuff that they never will look at again because they screwed it up really, really bad, and it just sits there and screams shame at you. You know, I'm being very silly, but that kind of thing is very very common. So I encourage everybody to practice these skills, because all of the stuff I'm talking about may not be learned or understood or successful on that first go of it, you know. And I don't want anybody to be disheartened because these techniques are a little bit harder than the stuff that they've experienced before. I'm just going to check and see if I've got some more questions. If anybody has some more questions that they want to pipe in or enter into the chat, I'm happy to hang tight a minute and see how we're doing. Sorry, edges. Let's see. Talked about that. Okay. What size carbide burnisher do you use to burnish the inside rim of a bezel? So the carbide burnisher that I have is originally made of square stock that's probably 2 millimeters square, and it has a curve at the end that's very much like a dome, but it only goes from opposite side to opposite side, and then it's squared on the edges. I believe that it's something that you could pre-order from GRS, pre-polished, pre-cut, and because it's carbide, you may almost never need to adjust the polish on that. I'll put a link to that product in the YouTube if I locate exactly the one that I have that I recommend. So I think that that is a great way to start practicing that that bright cut, but in a non-traditional way. I have questions about tumbling and finishing bezels, but not sure if you want to talk about that now or in another Zoom call. Tumbling and finishing, sure, yeah, no, I mean, we can certainly touch on other techniques on how to deal with the bezels. It doesn't have to all be fabrication. Let's talk about finishing.
I first would like to hear your process as far as where, like, do you tumble your pieces? If you do, at what point in the process do you do it? And then what steps follow that? That would be really helpful.
Okay, so tumbling. I really don't advise using your tumbler for everything. What I do recommend it for is if you're putting together a chain, something that might be dangerous to polish traditionally, right? Or something with lots of tiny nooks and crannies where maybe your buff won't get into that piece. But I'm always going to be pairing that with a polishing process afterwards, because often your tumbler is not polishing as much as it is leaving a tiny burnished surface. And usually that's not a high polish. It's more of a satin finish, and it's not going to be that beautiful, you know, sheen of metal that you're looking for. So my tumbler is used for things I get back from my caster. It's used for tining earring parts before setting the stones. It's used for all of the chains that I do after I've soldered them. Right now we're making a bracelet that is a bunch of 18 karat bezels with jump ring hinges and a pinned hinge. So pinning is when you take a piece of wire and ball it up on one end, throw it through whatever you're going to throw it through, that's a tube or a hinge or whatever, and then ball it up on the other end, basically making a balled hinge. So in this case, I've pre-polished all of my bezels. I've pre-polished the parts and pieces, but once I do that pinning step and I've got this articulate bracelet full of parts and pieces, I will probably put it into the tumbler and then repolish again when it comes out. But just for the sake of cleaning up those tiny little crevices where my torch may have done some taking away of the polish.
So you might not even use the tumbler at all for a heavy bezel. You might
Correct.
just polish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when it comes to a heavy bezel, I think we're using a pretty substantial piece of metal. I can usually hold on to it pretty well, and I I often either want to specifically texture or specifically high polish. And if I'm doing one or the other, then I don't think that the tumbler is going to do anything productive except just cut time out of my process, right? Because you put some in a tumbler, it takes 45 minutes, an hour, 5 hours, 7 hours, however long your machine, based on its quality and speed, is going to work. If you have a magnetic pin finisher that costs $600, then maybe it's 15 minutes. But if you have a rotary tumbler that costs 45, it may be there all night. So for me, I'm going to try to, and I have a rotary tumbler, right? I haven't invested, because I don't use it, I haven't invested in a pin finisher yet. I used to have access to one. They've got their uses, very amazing for chains. But again, since we don't use them that often, I tend to avoid it because I think that it's really just going to take longer than if I had done it manually with my polishing machine. Is that all? Any follow-up questions?
I have kids coming through, so that's why I put myself on mute again. I just
Gotcha.
I am always dealing with the texture that my tumbler leaves behind, and how
Mm-hmm.
many layers of, I feel like I'm going back and having to repolish
Right.
over
Right.
again, and it's very frustrating. And I'm just sitting here, like, even now I've been working at it for probably a year, just trying to get my polishing down, and I still hate the texture from the tumbler. But there's not really any other way to like burnish, and I know it does work hard in a little bit for filigree.
Mm-hmm.
So
Right.
still trying to nail down, like, how do I tackle all these little tiny micro divots without taking off a lot more metal, finding that sweet spot of getting what I need from both.
Well, what I might start with is finding a different style of um, tumbling media. So maybe your medium is too hard. If you're using steel shot, maybe it's too pointy. That might be causing a lot of your issues. So you may want to invest some time and a little bit of money experimenting with different tumbling media, right? Find something that is going to be kinder to your delicate pieces than not. And this might be totally a pain in the butt, but you could also consider, if it was a piece that you were spending a lot of time on, putting some nail polish varnish, like some, just some cheap nail polish around your polished parts that are already fine, and then tumbling afterwards. That should add that protective barrier, and then you can just dissolve it in acetone later. Takes a lot of time. There's that balancing act, but if you were really concerned about not screwing it up after the fact, that would be a way to take care of a very special piece that you have afforded the time and attention to detail with, because it's expensive, because you've already put so much time into it. You might want to take that extra step. So try to find a different media, try to protect that surface. And then I'm not sure if you are polishing with just rouge or if you're also using Tripoli. That may have an effect on how quickly you can get something cleaned up versus, but I know your work is a lot of crisp edges, so Tripoli may be more damage than help at some points because it can tend to take away a lot of that material.
I am currently using like probably 15 different things, but in general, I use the blue, these guys, I don't know what they're called.
Let's see.
Advantage. It's the
Yeah.
blue one. After tumbling, I use the blue one, and then I'm experimenting with Zam right now, and I've been using the blue Lexi
Mm-hmm.
which are kind of like they're supposed to polish and remove like tiny scratches at the same time. Anyways,
Right.
I can talk to you about the specifics a little bit more on our own, but I think just trying to figure out like what is your, like once you've set your stone and
Right.
you've cleaned up your around your bezel, what do you do next?
Okay, so if I am, let's say I'm doing a piece of sterling silver, I've set my stone with my hammer punch and it's left a bunch of little divots across the top, and that's not the look I was going for. I wanted a clean bezel. The first tool that I'm going to grab is an Italian green wheel from AutoFry. They are pretty much safe on most stones. I will not say all because I won't be the one that you get to blame. Test it first. But I've had a pretty good go of it with agates and faceted stones, and you know, I wouldn't use it on a tanzanite. I probably wouldn't use it on an opal. I've heard you shouldn't use it on a turquoise. Would I probably still do it next to a turquoise? Probably. Would I be careful and conscious of how I was using it? Sure, it is still an abrasive tool, right? So the Italian green wheel comes in a kind of disc shape for your rotary tool, and I use a shaping stone to kind of adjust it into kind of like a right angled knife edge, so that I can, or maybe slightly tighter than a right angle, so that I can have that angle kind of go in onto my bezel without touching maybe whatever else it's near. And I'm going to clean up my hammer setting with that tool. I might clean up the walls if it needs anything. But then I'm going to Tripoli and polish and call it a day. And Tripoli and rouge polish are just two incredibly approachable polishing compounds. One has a bit more grit and abrasive, the Tripoli, that would be your pre-polish, but it won't give you that bright shine. And then you'd wash and clean and then go in with rouge. But that would be my 3 steps after I set a stone. Is I would go in with my Italian green wheel, then I would go in with my Tripoli, and then I would go in with rouge, and then I would be done. I wouldn't be fussing or messing with anything additional. All right, so we are about an hour and a half in. Does anybody have more questions? I'm happy to keep talking. You guys are all still here, so more than happy to be helpful if we have any questions on any of this process. All right, most of you guys have found me here on Instagram. That's kind of the main way to get in touch if you have questions about any of this process. If you want to see any of the videos that I talked about, I'm happy to send them to you, you know, copy and paste those links. If you can't find them, I know sometimes it's hard to find something just because somebody mentioned it. We do teach these heavy bezels at our school, both to our beginners and as a private lesson, depending on kind of where you are in your skill set. And so I'm working on bringing that into an online course with a whiteboard with some more additional videos. But this was kind of one of those lead-ins to kind of see what your questions were and where I could focus on explaining myself more in a way that is not readily available when you're just Googling something online when we're talking about bezel setting. So I'm not sure we'll get it done in 2020, but hopefully in 2021, we will have an online video for you guys to watch of exactly how I do those 3 styles of stone setting that I was talking about. If anybody is interested in supporting us through Patreon, which is the way that we bring you guys these live videos, these Q&As, these guest talks, you guys can check that out. It was in our email that I sent out earlier, and I will definitely be linking it in the YouTube. That's just a way to contribute on a monthly basis to support us in tandem for the things that we are bringing to you guys through Instagram, through these Zoom chats, on YouTube, and it's a really helpful way to support us. what you guys can expect. This is kind of the first month that I've done 2 videos already. Last Monday we had Talking Trends with Chloe Swanson. You guys can check that out on YouTube. What that was about was the 2 of us kind of got together and had some additional Q&As from our crowd, just talking about where jewelry was coming and going, and the rise and fall of various designers and things that you could be looking out for as you're designing or wearing or selling jewelry. So if you guys wanted to check that out, it's up on our YouTube. Hopefully, as the months progress, we'll be offering a lot more of these Q&As on various topics, a lot more guest talks on all sorts of subjects. So if you guys have questions about what we could be supplying content on, if you want a Q&A about a specific technique, if you want to see somebody specific come on and talk for an hour or 2 with me and with you, please let me know. Send me an email, send me a DM, leave it in the comments. I'm more than happy to try and track down all the details and teach and explain and show them to you. So I really appreciate it. I'm so thankful, and I guess that's it for tonight. So thank you guys. I appreciate it, and have a good night.